Hello, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Thank you to all of our viewers who are tuning in to our 10 years of community celebration. My name is Jasmine McFarlane White. I am the community manager here at HashiCorp, and it is my pleasure to introduce you all to this evening where we are celebrating 10 years of community. We would not be here if it wasn't for you, all of our supporters, the practitioners, our subscribers. So this really is our way of saying thank you. And we're going to have some fun tonight. We have special guests who I am so honored who could join us today. But first, before we introduce our special guest, let me turn it over to one of our most, how do I even describe him? He is one of our most, our biggest champions. He knows the entire HashiCorp stack. So if you have questions, now is the time to answer. He is one of our ambassadors. So if you don't know what an ambassador is, please reach out to us, drop your questions in the chat. Let us know that you want to know about the ambassador program. They are our biggest champions for HashiCorp. And so I'm going to turn it over to Michael Aldridge, who is an ambassador, and he's going to be our moderator for today. But thank you again for joining. Drop your questions, drop your locations in the chat so that we know exactly where you're coming from. And now over to you, Michael.
Thank you, Jasmine. It is a pleasure to join you here. And wow, 10 years of community. I can't believe it's gone by so quickly since I joined the HashiCorp community about 5 years ago myself. I come to you live from Dallas, Texas, and it's amazing to be part of this global community here on the stream this evening.
Yeah.
It's my pleasure to introduce to you our panel guests, co-founders Mitchell Hashimoto, Armand Dadgar, CEO Dave McJanet, and Director of Community, Melissa Gurney-Green. Thank you all for joining us.
Hey, thanks so much for hosting us.
Oh, wow, yeah.
Hello, everyone.
All right, now that we have the Brady Bunch view going, with 10 years, let's start off with a retrospective question, looking back. If you had a magic wand and you could go back in time, you get to change one thing about HashiCorp. What is the one thing that you're going to change with your magic wand?
Ooh. That's a tough question. If you only get a
We'd write everything in Rust, obviously.
Oh, starting straight with the Holy War, I see.
Would you change the name, Mitchell?
Yeah, actually, I probably would. I think that Armand and I spent about a week trying to come up with a different name, and then we decided we'd rather build things instead. But I think I would have given that a much longer period than a week. Yes, but I don't think that's practically. I don't think that affects anything. So I'm not sure. Yeah.
So in that week, you mentioned it took a week. Was it a lot of back and forth on the name? Was it something that just there was no?
It was just like a week.
Or?
If I remember right, it was just a week of like we would randomly have like lists of like what about this and what about this, and everything was kind of equally not great. Yeah.
Yeah, it was exactly that. It was just a running tally. And I think we just our view was like we'll give ourselves a week. If we can't think of anything better, then we just stick with HashiCorp and move on with our lives.
Yeah.
I would pick
I
would pick a pretty practical one around our efforts in offering our products as managed services individually. I think we actually started the HCP development effort in, was it 2018 effectively, Mitchell, if you recall? It was around there, right?
Yeah.
Because it was pretty, I think it was pretty clear. It was, sorry, just to repeat the thought, and I think what's pretty clear is that there was an interest in consuming our individual products as managed services among some of the smaller companies. I think the bet was the bigger companies within 5 years would also feel that way, but it just takes a really long time to get there.
Yeah, if I had hindsight with the sort of like the way around 2018, like the way the markets were and stuff. Like if I remember right, Armand and I talked about building managed services for all our stuff in 2017, and we didn't really bring it up seriously because we were doing so much. We're like, we just don't financially like have enough money to do all this, but like in reality, we could have. It always just seems like harder than it is, I guess, in the moment. I think that would have been better.
Well, and I think to your point, it's like if I could do things differently, it'd probably be some of the products that we invested in that spread us thin that we ended up not keeping, like things like Auto, where we spent a lot of time building it, but then ended up shelving it. Surf ended up kind of being a distraction because then Console was the successor to it anyway. Atlas was a huge distraction. So there's probably some of those product things that's like if you could go back and you knew it again, you wouldn't waste time on it.
Yeah. The only one I don't think is a distraction was Surf. I think like that was like a necessary step, but the other ones for sure, yeah.
Hindsight is such a funny thing. Melissa, I'd love to hear from you. Community is such an organic thing, but across the last 10 years, is there something you would have changed of the way the community's grown or the way that the company's engaged, something you would have done differently?
I think there's probably some more community engagement I would have done with specific individuals that would change, but overall, I'm really happy with how the community has grown and come together. Some of the things that we did with community earlier on in my tenure, I've only been here for about 5 years of it, so but some of the things that we've done with the community earlier on in my tenure aren't necessarily scalable now, but I wouldn't take them back for sure.
Sure. So it sounds like lots of interesting things of, if you knew what you do now, then things might have been different, but everybody seems happy with, how the path that got us to here.
I would say generally
you have
speaking,
to be happy.
Yeah, I mean, I think that generally speaking, I think there's not very much I would change, truthfully. I think the sort of the spread, the idea of spreading multiple products around, the idea of investing deeply in the open source versions to help people and add enormous value to the world before focusing on the commercial side, I think is was fared very, very well.
Yeah. I don't mean, like, I always think like you can't, like all those mistakes, it made you grow in different ways. So like you kind of like in hindsight, you wish certain things didn't happen, but like who knows what would have happened if you changed your mind, like other things could have changed.
Sure. So let's move to another question. The Tao of HashiCorp is something that's fascinating to me. It's something that I think is almost unique in the way it's presented. And it takes some very clear stances. In the last 10 years, and as the company's grown, and as your reach has expanded, are there things in the initial value set of the company that have had to change or had to be adjusted in order to support that growth?
It's interesting because the Tao of HashiCorp, so there's two documents. There's sort of the Tao of HashiCorp and the principle of HashiCorp. And we always describe them as, one describes sort of like how we build the products, and the other one describes how we run the organization. And what's interesting, and I think frankly surprising actually about both, is that we haven't changed either of them, basically since they were first written. So if, I think the Tao is literally might be word for word unmodified from the original, publication. And I think it's funny because I look back and at the time, a lot of it was pretty, I won't say controversial, but some of it was sort of countercultural at the time, meaning, today we take immutability for granted, but when we published it, everyone was like, it was heyday of configuration management and, nobody did immutability. And I think we were early on, maybe we got a little wonky, we called it communicating sequential processes or CSP, but really it's, microservice is maybe how you'd, if you made it less academic, you'd call it microservices. So I think some of those things are, had held the test of time, even though at the time, it was very much LAMP stacks that were monolithic, that were running with config management. So like a lot of that stuff was pretty countercultural. And I think it turned out that a lot of that stuff was sort of correct, in the sense that I think as you got mature on cloud, you sort of had to adopt those practices of microservices and, immutability and, infrastructure as code and, kind of a lot of those principles held up. And I think on the same side, on the corporate principles, I think we've changed a little bit of the language, but most of that was actually just clarification. Like none of the principles changed, none of the core text changed. It was just like some of the copy just because people kind of were confused on some of the grammatical phrasing, but it served us remarkably well. And I think one of the things that's sort of shocking is that it hasn't really needed to change as the company has scaled.
Nailed it on the first try.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's arguably stuff you could add or whatever, but I mean, I think that the whole point is like they're pretty fundamental, like cultural elements that they don't need to change after only 10 years.
You say after only 10 years, does that, or, do you see that in the next 10 years as the company continues to evolve that things might change? Or
No, I don't mean to imply that. I just mean that like 10 for something like as like I think fundamental is like pragmatism. Like I don't think like that sort of like cultural element in like society changes after 10 years.
Slightly more longitudinal time scales for those changes then.
Exactly, yeah.
Fair enough. Well, kind of looking at change over 10 years, I'd love to hear from each person on this one. What is one thing that's the same, in your opinion, as it was 10 years ago? And then one thing that you think has actually really changed? One thing that if you were to tell yourself of 10 years ago, they would look at you and say, wow, that's different. Let's start with Dave for this one.
So I can't speak to 10 years. I think I can speak to almost 7.
As far back as you can.
So so the question is what has changed?
One thing that you think has been held constant over the last decade, and then one thing that you think has really substantively changed.
Yeah, I think the first of those, actually, I'll give it to these guys. They had a really strong point of view about what the core principles of cloud computing were going to be. Infrastructure as code, as an example, that was pretty revolutionary 10 years ago. It turned out to be right. That's how the world works. Identity is the basis of security. That's right. So I think those things are fundamentally unchanged, actually, and I don't think they will change because those are the paradigms for the cloud model. What has changed? This is not surprising, but I think we're so firmly in the information flow of the cloud market that you can kind of see what the next problem along is all the time, because we speak to the biggest companies in the world about their infrastructure plans now. 10 years ago we would have been guessing. We had a point of view. I think now you're on the wave, if you know what I mean. You're surfing the wave. We know what people's issues are. They explain them to us. We meet with hundreds of the Fortune 500 every year, and that's a really, really privileged position. I think it's kind of how startups work in some sense. Once you elevate into that information flow, you have this sort of very unique lens to keep going. I think that has allowed us to think about the next problem along, and things like Waypoint, things like Boundary. All the things you've seen from the sort of last decade is really based on getting in that information flow.
Interesting. Melissa, what are some things you think have held constant and changed?
Oh, goodness. Over the last 5 years, probably the thing that's been the most constant is kindness. And that's within the company, but also inside the community. My first conference, going as an employee of HashiCorp, all of the people that would come up and just say, hey, thank you. We love your tools. We love this, or we want new things, but thank you so much for everything you've done, and being there and being able to accept those thank yous on behalf of all of the people at the company that actually did the work has been just amazing, and it hasn't stopped. And it's something that I remind myself of every day, because you don't get that a lot in technology. like you just don't. So I try to remind myself every day that this is where we are, and it's one of my goals to keep it that way. Then I'd say something that's changed is the way we get to engage with people and enable them. I've worked pretty hard with the team to try to get our tools more accessible to people who don't speak English as one of my goals. And the fact that we've had the autonomy to do that, and that people are responding to that is huge for me. But being able to engage people on a broader scale is really exciting, and it's something that's constantly changing. So
I can absolutely echo that comment of the kindness of the community. One of the memories that definitely sticks out to me was about 2 years ago, having just a moment of inattention during a console raft upgrade and accidentally losing the entire key value store, which was backing my Vault cluster. And jumped into the Gitter chat, said, "Hey, I've just made a mistake. Does anyone have any suggestions?" And suddenly getting a whole bunch of very helpful replies and people who were, coming up with ideas I would have never thought of in my, immediate state of panic. The community is truly one of the strongest things I think I've run into with the HashiCorp suite.
That's a really great story of it, for sure.
I could tell you in the moment it didn't feel great, but
but it was a good learning experience, I'm sure.
Oh yes, test the backups.
Test the backups and test the procedure.
Yes. Well, Mitchell and Armand, as the people who definitely have the 10-year perspective, I'd love to know what's changed, what's different.
You're unmuted already, Armand. Go for it.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll even go back further than 10 years, which is I think when I think back to 2006, when like I first played with AWS, I remember thinking like, wow, cloud is pretty hard. And somehow in 2022, cloud is still pretty hard. So, it's funny because, in some sense you're like, oh, well, inevitably, like it was hard to begin with because it was early and then like it'll get easier. And I think it actually only got harder, to be honest, because back then it was all like VPC classics. So your instance was like ran on the public internet. And now it's like a gauntlet of like, okay, like why won't I get traffic to my thing? Is it like the VPC config? Is it the security group? Is it my network policy? Is it the firewall? It's like there's like 55 layers of things to debug. And you're like, why won't my stupid VM get traffic? So it's like somehow cloud has remained stubbornly difficult, over, God, I don't know what that is now, 15 years. I think the flip side of it, what has changed dramatically is I think the state of tooling is way better, right? And I think part of that's a HashiCorp statement, but part of that's a more broad statement, which is like, the tooling we had at our disposal was, frankly terrible in 2006. A lot of it was just like barely maintained open source or like, it was like companies kind of like put out the thing they run internally, but it wasn't like a product, right? Like if you tried actually running some of these things, you were like, there's no documentation. It only works for one very specific happy path. Like it was all kind of terrible. Versus now I think about what you have and like the richness of tooling, whether it's around, our CI infrastructure, whether it's around, tools to provision, deploy applications, platforms like, Nomad and Kubernetes. What we have on observability is like light years ahead of like, what we had back then. So, I think the state of tooling in general is much more sophisticated than what it was in 2006, but the difficulty of the problem has somehow only increased.
The difficulty has scaled to match our capability.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I was gonna say the sameness is similar. I mean, I think that for the company, I mean, I think that the strive to like make things more approachable, the excitement when something that was hard becomes easier, like it's still the same that I see from like before. Like back then it was just basically Packer and Vagrant, right? Like there's the excitement of when you ran Packer and you got an AMI at the end. That was really cool. Now you kind of take that for granted, but then there's new things that like still are happening 10 years later, like when you first run Boundary and like you hit an authorize button and you can now connect to a database you couldn't connect to before. Like the things that were hard that are now easy, like that's really cool. You still get that feeling of excitement. And then on the different side, I was going to go a totally different direction though. Like I think the big difference is like the growth and presence of enterprise. Like it just didn't exist like in a real tangible form like 10 years ago, and especially for us as a startup, like it certainly didn't exist because like no one cared to talk to us. But I think the fact that like it actually exists now, it's really proven to be viable, and HashiCorp like as a company and community has like become a strong partner there and like aware of those needs and built towards them. Like that's very different, right, from the the very hackerish small culture of 10 years ago.
You know, you mentioned Packer. I think that's probably one of still my favorite magic moments of using any tool was the first time I got a Packer template to work and watching it type in the boot command.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Just something about watching it hit tab and start editing the grub command line. It's a very cool experience.
Opens a graphical window and starts typing. Yeah, I mean I still remember like the stubbornness that like you know, at the time it was just Armand and I, like the stubbornness we had to make things better. Like we wrote our own. I remember spending a week writing my own like FAT16 file system driver because I was just like it didn't matter, but it was the only way to get a specific version of Windows to boot, and like I was unhappy with how hard that was. It was like, I'm gonna spend a week just making that one thing better, and like it was just very stubborn. So the GUI typing was another example of like a lot of other tools opened it and then paused and said, okay, now please tab over and type this. And I was like, no, okay, how do I type this in the GUI window? So yeah.
You've got my curiosity now. Do you remember which version of Windows it was that you were having to patch around? That seems like an amazing bit of tech trivia.
Not at all. But they only would, you know, how Linux would boot with like a pre-seed file. The only way to supply a pre-seed equivalent for Windows was to put a text file on a FAT16 floppy drive. So that's what I was working with at the time.
Amazing. So I know that the experience that has led us all to our current roles has taken us on interesting career paths. For me, I've gone from hyperscalers to 3-person startups and now boomeranged back to a publicly traded company. And one of the things that's always been fascinating is the scaling of the company itself. I think within infrastructure, we often think about scaling as, you know, you fire off an API call and it works. I am acutely aware now of scaling an engineering team being, you know, there is no API to HR. What has been your experience with going from 2 to 2,000 employees and the growth pains along the way and you know, how that's happened?
You go ahead, Armand.
Sure. I was just sort of laughing because I'm like, you kind of wish there was a Terraform for it. You wish you could just count equals 2,000, hit apply. But you are right. There is no API for it, unfortunately. As I look back, I think there's obviously a lot of hard parts to it, right? I think there's a lot of hard parts. There's a lot of rewarding parts. I think part of it that's, to me, the rewarding part, the part that's been super, almost hard to believe, is that we've managed to scale the company. Now it's almost like 2,500 people, so it's even bigger. But that we've managed to do it by like bringing in people who truly believe in the mission, who truly believe in the principles of the company. And so it's like, it's a surreal feeling, right? Like when it's like people you've never even met in different parts of the world, right? You know, we travel a lot and meet with our customers and users around the world, and you'll fly into some random place. You'll be in Thailand and you'll meet, you know, the HashiCorp team there, and here are these people who are so passionate about infrastructure, who are so passionate about solving these problems, who are, you know, deeply committed to the same principles of the company as you'd find in Munich or in San Francisco. And I think there's something really cool about that, right? The fact that it is this global community and it is, you know, people who are so deeply passionate about it, and the fact that other people, you know, thought that we weren't, you know, so crazy that they were willing to join and build a career at HashiCorp. You know, I think that's a cool thing, and it's fun to be able to celebrate those anniversaries with people. So I think the cultural side, the people side of it's really cool. I think the hard part of it is that like process and systems are designed for a particular scale, right? The thing that worked for, you know, 2 people when it was me and Mitchell was like, you know, we turned our swivel chair over and we're like, hey, what do you think we should work on today? You know, that doesn't really work at our size, right? So, you know, I think at every point, you know, when you went from 2 people to 15, everything broke. Then from 15 to 30 people, everything broke. Then 30 to 80 people, everything broke. And, you know, at every one of those scale points, like everything breaks because the process you design that makes sense for a size point and a set of problems doesn't make sense when you double or triple the number of people, and the system doesn't make sense anymore. And so I think that's the hard part, is that I describe it as a firefight, but it's sort of like you're rebuilding the plane as it's in flight, but you're going from sort of a Wright Brothers plane to a prop plane to a jet engine to a 787, you know, while you're in flight. and those are just very different kind of companies. So I think that's the hard part of it but I think the people and the culture and the mission of it is the fun part that makes it all sort of worth doing.
Yeah, I would agree with that, Arm. Just really quickly, I think you don't appreciate how different each stage is. It feels like a very different company every phase, and I think that's what keeps it interesting too. Is that it's just very different dynamics, very different processes. But we always refer to the that quote that a company is nothing more than a group of people aligned around a common idea. And I think that is the truth in software companies in particular. And we always claim we're aligned around two ideas. One is the mission around the market problem, and the second one is a set of principles that dictate how we're going to collectively act in the retirement of that mission. So I think that's sort of what Armand's referring to, is you get that consistency of humility, kindness. That pragmatism sort of is why people sign up and join to do what they do. And I think you see that around the world, regardless of as the company goes through different scaling points, which feels different. The kind of the core feels the same.
Yeah, I think for me, it's just like at a very basic level, it was the changes over time. It's just more of a growing respect for not just the challenges, but like the way they have to be solved, and the people that need to come in, and the different roles that need to exist, and how everyone brings value to a company. I mean, I would say, like, very naively 10 years ago, I remember like visiting enterprise software homepages. I won't name anyone. But I don't need to name any of them, because all of them, I went to their homepages and I was like, this is so stupid. Like, what's a white paper and why would anyone want one? Like, it's so dumb. And I just like, that was like my naive thinking then, and like over time realizing why they're not dumb, and who needs them, and why they're the best form of delivering that information to that person. Like, who writes those, and like all that stuff. Like, that's just one tiny example, but that spread across like every form of need for a company at different sizes. Like, I think that respect is the most interesting thing that I learned from scaling. Yeah.
You either die young or live long enough to become a big company.
Oh, no. Melissa, I'd love to hear about scaling the community, because I remember joining the community in the era of the mailing lists. And it's come a long ways since then.
Oh, it has, and we've had a lot of debates around what to do and how to do when and all that stuff. Right now, we're on forums and this awesome developer portal thing, and doing all kinds of engagement through Hashi Talks and stuff like that. And it's just an incredible evolution. I think one of the things that we learned earlier on is that the instant message kind of level of communication doesn't scale. So finding a way to do right by the community and at the same time give ourselves some sanity was a key priority coming in.
Sanity.
Yes, especially on the engineering side, because we love our community, so we want to answer the questions, but being able to enable the community to help each other out, like your story earlier about all the people that came and replied to help you. It's something that we still think about a lot and still try to do.
Yeah. I think it's been fascinating to watch. You can tell when new people join the community. And then it's like, they integrate very quickly. I think that it's been a very welcoming group as it scaled.
Yeah.
I don't know how you've done it, but...
Well, I mean, when people don't act the way that you want them to engage, you just kind of tell them, right? You talk to them a little bit about it and try to be kind and just be like, look, we want new people to feel welcome here, even if they're asking a question that's been asked a million times. We want a million more of those questions. We want new questions too, right? So it's just kind of being frank and being like, look, we want this to be a place where new people can feel comfortable and vulnerable and learn too. And everything is learning. We're all learning all the time.
Absolutely. Well, as things have grown bigger, I'd love to hear how this has affected your personal lives. I know that for me, when I've gone from companies that were very small to bigger ones, it was suddenly like, oh, there's on call. We're serious now. Mitchell, I'd love to hear from you specifically. Having bits of your name plastered across blogs and conferences and everything else out there, how has that kind of affected the way you view your personal life with the company?
Well, it taught me that I would have changed the name of the company 10 years ago. But I mean, otherwise, I mean, in my personal life, I would say that stuff doesn't impact me so much. It's not like some pop culture like AAA movie sort of thing. It's infrastructure. It's a very B2B thing. Like it's you're not getting recognized anywhere or anything like that. Once in a while, but pretty rare. No, I don't. I think for me, like personally, the way the growth has affected me is more around like as I've seen the company grow through these stages and as I lived through many of them, like reaffirming like which parts of it I enjoyed the most. And I think that like very publicly came to light when I stepped down into an individual contributor, right? Like I think that's the biggest personal effect that this has had for me. It was like there's a certain level of necessity that the founder does at various stages of the company that you like or dislike or whatever. And I think as we got to the point where I could comfortably step down to an IC and feel good about the company still, and the leadership that we have and all that, like I think that's both the evolution of the company as well as me taking, like, that's the personal impact it really had. Although I was at a cafe last week and then the people next to me were talking about Terraform. I never exposed my identity. I don't have any stickers on my laptop, partially for this reason, because I don't want anyone to know anything. But it was interesting hearing them talk about it.
No, I can ask ChatGPT to create my Terraform templates. I don't need to ask you.
I feel like in the Bay Area as well, there's a slightly different kind of coffee shop commentary going on. Here in Dallas, I think I'm less likely to hear about Terraform at my local coffee shop.
Yeah, I'm in LA, but yeah.
Okay.
It's like SF is like every coffee shop. LA, it's like these were the only people talking about tech. So, yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Armand, as the company's changed, same question.
It's in some sense one of the interesting things when I look back is like, in 2013 when we asked if people wanted to chat with us about some of this thing, whether it was, hey, do we want to talk about Packer, about golden images or whatever, people would be like, no, like we don't believe in golden images. We're doing like whatever, Chef or Puppet or something. And I think now we have almost the opposite problem, which is like HashiCorp has, as a result of the scale and success, it's like it's in so many conversations that like now everybody kind of wants to chat with us, which is a good problem. But the problem is like, the amount of time in your day hasn't really changed. And so I think, probably one of the biggest shifts is, especially that impacts personal life, is the amount of travel we do, right? I think, this year I changed my airline loyalty from United to Delta, and yet managed to achieve status on both of them to give sort of a sense of just how much travel is involved, right? Because I think a lot of it is just, it's going to user conferences and talking with people who are, some people are just learning what Terraform is, and other people are power users on the whole stack. And then you have, customers around the world that really want to understand, how do I use this technology and how do I sort of go deeper with it? And so I think that's been an interesting shift for us, where you go from like, it's almost like you're pulling teeth with some of these folks to want to meet with you, to sort of now there's just an incredible demand for education and knowledge and learning, and people want to come up to speed and get empowered on this stuff. And I think, unfortunately, we haven't found a way to clone or teleport, so that translates to a lot of travel.
We can't scale the Dadgar replica set yet?
Unfortunately, we're working on it. Yeah, I know Dave is probably still like, his time zone somewhere over the Pacific, I think, at the moment.
Yeah, I would answer it similarly. I think you kind of got to step back a little bit and reflect on who our constituents are. You have an enormous set of people that use our open source products each and every day, and we have a real responsibility to them. I think that's what's different as you get bigger, and the impact of what we do becomes broader. And so you have that open source community, but then very in a very real sense, we have some of the biggest companies on the planet whose most important things run through our stuff each and every day. And there's a third constituency, which is the employees. There are employees that work for us. There are people in our partner community whose livelihoods all come from what we do. And I think it's hard to unpick that. And in terms of, why Armon travels the way it does, well, that's actually a big part of it, is because, we have a personal responsibility for the people that come on this journey with us. And I think you can't help but feel that. There's tons of positivity that comes from that, but that's also very, very, very real. It's at the end of the day, this is a people thing, people building things that other people use, and that's front and foremost in our minds, personally.
Yeah.
And I'd say for me, like, coming here was the big life change. so I went from a place where I was like 90% travel and losing my mind and getting status on multiple airlines to a much more sane environment. So personally, things are wonderful, and my kids are like super thankful. And what's funny is they steal my HashiCorp shirts and run around in them everywhere we go, and then people come up to us and they're like, HashiCorp? And I'm like, yeah. But I'm in Seattle, so most of our conversations over coffee are also about tech. But I'd say in terms of like, as the company's scaled, I'd say the nature of the questions have been the biggest thing to change. Like, who are you and what do you do, to how do I accomplish this great big thing? So that's been exciting as I have traveled. The bit I travel now and talking to people, the level of impact of the conversation is definitely different.
I definitely get the people recognizing. I was wearing the HashiConf 2022 shirt in the San Jose airport on Saturday morning, and somebody just walked up to me and was like, "I remember you from your talk." It was like, okay.
Totally.
Yeah, I don't wear any HashiCorp stuff. It's not for lack of love for the company. It's because I don't want that.
I may have to adopt this plan.
Yeah. You also hear some really interesting things because they don't know that you have anything to do with the company. So yeah.
The undercover approach. I like it. So when I was at HashiConf Global, I had the pleasure of speaking with many of the project managers over the various product suites. And a topic that came up often was the juggling act, the balancing between, on one hand, you have the open source product that gets people in the door and gets people excited about infrastructure as code. But of course, a company has to make money, and there's the enterprise product on the other side. And the juggling act of how you handle these two components and the tension that sometimes forms between them. I'd love to hear a little bit about how this has kind of shaped decisions, or how this has maybe affected the direction of things, especially given the current economic climate where perhaps companies don't have the funds that they would have liked to have had available to spend on high quality tooling.
Sure, I can kind of talk about it. In some sense, I think what's interesting is people often ask too, like, has our philosophy changed now that we're a public company, or like, have we changed our approach to open source? And I don't think so, because I think for us, the view has always been pretty fundamental that there's almost these, as we think about it, there's almost these two different problems you're solving, right? One problem for us, and we kind of refer to it as sort of like the golden workflow problem, which is like, for the developers, for the end users, for the operators, like, what's the golden workflow, if you will, that we're trying to solve, right? So for Terraform, as an example, it's like, how do you have a really good provisioning tool that can handle sort of multi-cloud, multi-SaaS, whatever? And on that dimension, we want it to be like the best workflow tool for doing that problem. And it shouldn't be like crippleware, whatever. We want to manage one VM, you want to manage 1 million VMs, knock yourself out. Then on the other side, we kind of think about it as like, okay, but what's the set of challenges around, like, we consider these more like system of record challenges, or you can think about it as like a large company is trying to use this technology, right? So great, if I'm one person using Terraform open source, like, wonderful. I don't have a whole bunch of different problems around state management or user management or role-based access control or auditing or any of that stuff. But the moment you're like, I'm actually 1,000 developers in a large enterprise, it's like, well, the things I care about are all of a sudden very different, right? I care about, like, yeah, I want single sign-on, and I want access controls, and I want team management, and I want audit logs, and I want policy as code. And there are all these problems that are actually kind of unrelated to the golden workflow, right? Like, it's sort of a separate set of problems. It's about, how do I use the product at scale? And so we've always thought about, like, okay, if we sort of authentically commit and say, for the open source community, we really want to continue to solve for that golden workflow, add value, make it a really great tool users love. And then I think, hey, for the enterprise companies that are getting value from our stuff because they're using it at scale, fair is fair. Let's build a commercial product for them, and they should pay for it because they're getting, if they have 1,000 developers using it, they're clearly getting value from it, right? And so that's where we sort of focus the commercial products on. And I think that's always been the sort of philosophy. I think that continues to be the philosophy. And I think part of it goes back to our view that like open source is the root of what makes us successful, right? The reason people find our software, adopt it, download it is because of that open source community. And, we want to continue feeding that in an authentic way. And then at the same time, like to build a business, we're actually solving these different set of problems, which is about using the open source at scale in the organizational context. So it's funny, we don't often think about it as necessarily like a balancing act. It's like where the balance is a resource question of like, you only have so many people, but ultimately they're two separate sets of problems and you're solving both of them.
Yeah. I definitely understand what you mean with the, the different challenges. I've yet to have an auditor come want to see that I approved the push to my blog.
Yeah, exactly, right? It's just like it's a different set of concerns.
Yeah. Fascinating. Anyone have anything else they want to add on that? I think that was a very complete answer.
It's great. I think we've been really consistent about it, actually. I think we've been really consistent and built a lot of trust around it.
Yeah.
Yep.
Definitely. So if you could look into a crystal ball, and we're looking at the next 5 years, what do you see in the world of infrastructure as code in this community? Do you think that we're more or less, refining the status quo, or do you see change on the horizon? Do you think that, ChatGPT was tossed around earlier, and a coworker earlier today did send me a ChatGPT generated Terraform module. I'm not brave enough to deploy it yet, but it was interesting to see that as like, maybe that is what the future holds.
I mean, I think in a lot of ways there's a lot of refining because, what is refining to us is still cutting edge or not unknown to a vast majority of the world. I remember, this is older, but I gave a talk in Belgium about Terraform in 2000. It must have been 14, must have been right when it came out. And someone came up to me afterwards. I'm sure Armand will remember this. And someone came up to me afterwards and said in a like polite but like harsh, because English wasn't their first language, so harsh way, basically like, next year, like, I enjoyed your talk, but next year please leave the Silicon Valley hipster crap back where you came from. It was sort of like, this is like way too like cloud. They like this conference I was at, to put it in perspective, had a track. They had only 2 tracks, and one track was dedicated to deploying on-premise hardware. So like, it's fine. That's still a big component, but like, that's sort of the energy of the conference. So maybe it's my fault, but I think that still represents a huge amount of the world. So like, I think refining, making things easier. It's like, we need to make like boundaries still super new, but and it's awesome, but like, it needs to become simpler and better to the point where like, whatever, like your neighborhood utility company can adopt it, or, and I think it's like a bit of ways from that. So I think that is one respect. I think the other side of like cutting edge stuff, like whatever, Chat GPT or something, like, I think that'll be interesting, but I think it's like less fundamentally, even if that becomes a big thing, that'll be that won't be like really adopted for like much longer, right? So I'm just like, in the next 5 years, we're talking about 5 years, I think it's more refining.
I'll maybe go back to the like, me and Mitchell joke about it all the time. It's like when I started as a developer, it's like if I wanted to push an update, I'd basically make my change locally, save the file, FTP to production, drag and drop it there, hit the Apache reload, and like, that was it. Like, I didn't have to write any code. I didn't have to know any YAML. I didn't have to know what the hell anything was. Like, it was that easy. And now, we sort of look at like, okay, as a developer, like, what do you need to learn? It's like, okay, you got to become a Git expert, CI/CD expert, like a PhD in YAML, learn all this cloud stuff, like write some HCL for Terraform. And so I think like the bar is like, you must be this tall to ride is like real high for modern cloud infrastructure. And so to me, it kind of goes back to that view of like, is it tenable that the cloud infrastructure in 2022 is just as complicated, if not more complicated, than it was in 2006? or can we actually lower the bar, right? And so I think, you know, in Mitchell's language, it's a refinement, but I think it's more than that. It's like, it's almost like how do you standardize some of these best practices around things like Terraform landing zones, for example, where it's like, instead of reinventing the wheel of a VPC setup or whatever, it's like, it should just be assumed that there's foundational standard stuff for some of that stuff. You're like, I don't write code for that. I pull in the Terraform module. It's just the standard. It sets up a basic account for me. And I can kind of move up the chain to sort of higher value stuff. And I think with things like Waypoint, our aspiration is like, how do you make it dumb again? Like, how do you make it as easy as it was, like FTP the file? And so I think it's some of that stuff where it's like, how do we make infrastructure less complicated, but without sacrificing all the power that it's given us? And I think the way you get through that is better standardization, better abstractions, right? More automation. I think that's a lot of, I think, what we need to do, because it's the, you know, we're not necessarily getting any smarter, but the problems are getting more complicated. Maybe ChatGPT saves us. I don't know. I'm convinced if it could, you know, if it could do whiteboard videos, I could put myself out of a job.
Whole new meaning to chat ops.
Exactly.
Waypoint is super fascinating to me, partly just because I'm clearly not its target user. And I love the idea of, you don't need to have that same level of understanding all the way down to the metal just to ship your web app. I think that's a really fascinating idea that, you know, you're right. I remember getting into the world of technology a decade and a half ago of like, yeah, FTP. I mean, it's going to kick everybody's user session, but that's fine. Like, this is how everyone does it.
They'll hit retry. It's fine. Don't worry about that.
So I'd love to go around the circle and ask, what's your favorite HashiCorp product and why? And given that Otto was mentioned, I'd like to extend this question to, it doesn't have to be a product that still exists. So, how about Melissa? Let's start with you.
All right, I'm going to take Terraform then. I came from ops and infrastructure, and it took a lot of the things that I hated the most about my prior job away. So I was in Seattle, so of course I had a lot of customers that were either going to the cloud or building clouds, and a lot of them wanted everything exactly the same. And my job was to build all their stuff exactly the same. And I'm like, this is a script. I'm a script. I'm a living script. So getting away from being a living script and being able to put that in the form of Terraform in its place, was beautiful and wonderful, and it gave me the opportunity to do more awesome things. So that for me was huge, and it's my favorite, and will probably always be my favorite.
Dave, you're up.
So this is a hard one for me. People know I like Packer. It just appeals to me. It's nice and simple. But I just think Console is my favorite product, and this is probably broadly known inside of our company, because I just think, you know, we have two categories of products. One of them solves a workflow problem, like things like Terraform, and then you've got the second category, which are like literally in the runtime path of every application. I think it just appeals to my interest in distributed systems. I think all the people that work here generally share that. You know, think about the complexity of orchestrating service networking across, you know, hundreds of thousands of distinct services. It's just a fascinating computer science problem, and it has many layers to it. So that without question is my favorite, because I think you can visualize how that's working. And then now I can't help whenever I see, you know, an application, like I swipe my credit card or whatever it is, like I know how that's working. You know, I think there's something appealing about that.
Yeah, I might go with, you know, I'll pick Nomad, you know, even though they're all my favorites, but Nomad's probably has a special place in my heart. And I think part of it's because I think, going back to Dave's point, it's like, it's the passion for some of the distributed system stuff. And it's like, if you're a distributed systems junkie, it's like, Nomad's got it all, right? Like every distributed system problem you can imagine, Nomad has it. And the fact that it's like, it does it at such incredible scale. And I know we've done some of these benchmarks where it's like, we do like the 2 million container challenge or whatever. There's just something to me like something awe-inspiring about being able to push enter and have, you know, a piece of software launch like 2 million instances of Redis for you somewhere in like 5 minutes. You know, as you're just like watching, and it's like, it's almost hard to even believe the graphs when it's launching like 20,000 instances per second. And you're just like, how is this even possible? Like, how does this thing work? And there's just something.
We see it sometimes. You see it sometimes on like on the APM tooling that people expose. They've got hooked up to Nomad, and it just blows your mind when you see the graphs.
It's just crazy. Yeah, I mean, the scale of some of this stuff, when people come and they're like, oh yeah, we have like, you know, 100,000 CPU cores under management or whatever. And you're like, it's just kind of cool. It's just cool to watch it work. And, you know, I know like that system is also probably our most technically complicated system, right? Just in terms of the engineering work that makes Nomad tick. It's like, it's a very complicated product. And, you know, there's something fun about it. Sort of we also learned, and it came at the end of our suite, right? Like at the end of the first 6 products, I should say. Like so it incorporated all the lessons of the other ones. And so everything that we kind of got wrong with Vault and Console and whatever, we sort of learned our lesson. And by the time we got to Nomad, we're like, okay, we're not going to make that mistake. Yeah.
Yeah, I've been asked this before, and it's I'm sure you can find past answers. I'll give the same one. I've always like sort of unashamedly said the Terraform is my favorite. I mean, and it's really because like the thing that got me into infrastructure to begin with was this intense like joy of automating things. And Terraform is like the ultimate. Actually, what Armand described watching Nomad deploy like 2 million Redis instances, it's similar actually, so maybe that would apply there. But for some reason, Terraform was like, to me, was like quintessentially what I wanted to achieve as a teenage programmer. Was like, I just wanted to like write some stuff, run a command, and like thousands of computers came into being, right? Like a giant like Borg mind like came into being. And so like I just had so much fun within like budgetary abilities, just spinning up and Terraform up, Terraform destroy, Terraform apply, Terraform destroy, Terraform apply, Terraform destroy, like back and forth. Like it was, especially when we first like built Terraform, I would just like stress test it manually by just apply, destroy, apply, destroy, apply, destroy. And it was just awesome just seeing I created stuff, it's gone. And we found some fun bugs in the cloud providers that way as well. So really awesome. Yeah.
Well, I'm wearing this shirt, so I have to say, you know, Nomad is my favorite. During my time at Google, Borg was an incredible piece of tooling, and the idea that Nomad turns your many, many servers into an amorphous blob of compute is very cool to me. I don't quite get the distributed systems side of it, but yeah, I definitely think it's cool, you know, to your point, Armand, where it's like, you know, wait a minute, in that topology view, how many gigabytes of RAM or terabytes of RAM do I have? You know, one command.
It's crazy when customers sometimes will send us a screenshot of your dashboard, and you're like, is that petabytes of memory? Like what?
Yeah.
You're like, what are you doing exactly?
It's like, what are you doing with all that? Never mind.
Yeah, like, that is a lot of horsepower.
Yeah. Well, with that, we're kind of at the end of time for questions. I'd love to open the floor if there's anything any of you would like to add before we close out this evening.
Maybe just a big thank you to you, first of all, for joining us and being an ambassador and you know, hosting this session with us. And I know for everyone who's joining from around the world, I see people from all over, from you know, Thailand to the rest of the world. So thank you all for joining and being a part of the HashiCorp community. And you know, honestly, we would have never made it this far if it wasn't for the support of the community, you know, every single day along the way. So, you know, a huge thank you, and you all are what made this possible.
Yep, echoing that. I mean, it's incredible how big our community has been. I'm sure Armand and I mean, we could both remember going to like a one meetup that wasn't a HashiCorp meetup, and there being like 10 people to listen to us ramble about something. And it's incredible that this huge community has grown and how much that you've helped HashiCorp grow. So yeah, thanks.
Yeah. Well, Mitchell, Armand, David, Melissa, thank you so much for joining us this evening. I'm now going to hand back off to our HashiCorp side host, Jasmine, to close us out for the night.
Well, that was really just so amazing and insightful. You know, whenever I get to hear Armand, Mitchell, Dave, and Melissa talk, I just get so inspired that I'm able to work with them or underneath them, underneath their leadership. But Michael, I have to say, like, I am overjoyed to have had you as our host. You were so amazing. And it is community members like you, ambassadors that like you, that just make everything worth it. So I really have to, I take my hat off to you. Thank you so much for giving your time and sharing, bringing the energy and sharing your wisdom, because you do know a lot about HashiCorp, about the ins and outs, not only about our products and our tools, but also about the Tao of HashiCorp and how it is that we work. And you understand how important it is for us to have community and how much the community means to us. So I have to just say thank you.
Well, definitely. Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to always be here and a pleasure to interact with the HashiCorp folks. It's an amazing team who I can tell everyone truly cares about what they're doing.
Yes, that is for sure. So now I wouldn't be the community manager if I didn't talk about some of our community programs. So before we leave, I just want to say that this doesn't have to be the last opportunity where you're able to come and hear things about HashiCorp, be it from our leaders, the community team, our ambassadors. You can also join the HashiCorp user groups. COVID really hit us hard. It hit the whole entire world hard, but we really want to try and bring our user groups back in person. So if you are able to, join a HashiCorp user group, and if there's not one near you, don't fret. Reach out to us. We are happy to start our user groups. Just to give you a little bit of statistics on our user groups, we have 160 groups in 59 countries. And so I saw people were talking about they're from Brazil, Canada, India, Thailand. We even have some local. You mentioned that you're in Texas. We have some people joining from North Carolina. I'm in New York City. So join us. We have groups all over. And then the last thing I want to say, or two more things. Sorry, my coworker is making her little appearance. The other two things I'll say is that we do have Hashi Talks. So yes, we wanted to be able to thank our community, and this is in English. And we do have our 24-hour Hashi Talks coming up in February, where you can register for that now. But we also have Hashi Talks that are unique to people in their respective languages. So if English is not your primary language, we have regional Hashi Talks that are coming up. Our next one is coming up in India, and followed by another one in France. So if you're interested in hearing more about unique use cases on how to use HashiCorp tools and products, go to hashi.co/HashiTalks-hub to see when all of the Hashi Talks are going to be produced. Sorry, my coworker. And then the last thing I want to say as we close out this 10 years of community celebration is that this is not it. This is not the only thing that we have to celebrate. We also have our 10 days of trivia going on Twitter right now. So first, you need to follow us at HashiCorp Users. That's our Twitter handle. And join in on the fun with the 10 days of trivia. There's some days left that you can still participate, and you have the opportunity to win some limited edition swag. All you have to do is respond to the questions correctly and for a chance to win. So with that being said, I think we're going to close tonight out. It has been a pleasure to be with you, Michael. And I want to thank, in their absence, again, Dave, Armand, Mitchell, and Melissa for joining us. And of course, we would not be here if it wasn't for the community. So I just want to thank the community for supporting us for 10 years and counting. Again, my name is Jasmine McFarlane White. I am the community manager at HashiCorp, and thank you for being with us tonight. Good night. Or good night, good morning, goodbye. How about that? Goodbye.
Interesting question.